So welcome back, and if you go to page 270 of the textbook, you'll see the next section where we're going to look at the course of the war. We're going to go quite quickly through this, although we're only going to take one lesson to do it. And the reason is the question that you're going to get isn't necessarily going to ask you to talk about the course of the war. It's going to say how well did the Americans deal with the threat that was Vietnam. So you're going to have to talk about it in that context as opposed to simply going battle by battle. So let's look at the start. So politically, the war is to ensure the success of democracy in South Vietnam. That's the story that the Americans are selling, that the American military, the American government is selling to the people of America. That's why the war is occurring, to ensure the success and the continuance of democracy in South Vietnam, propping up the unpopular Diem government. So you're going to support democracy by doing something that's undemocratic, by propping up an unpopular government. This sounds a bit, double speak, saying something but meaning something else. And that's pretty much exactly what's going on here. The Americans are making it really clear that they do not want elections. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on. But the whole idea is that this DM government, as unpopular as it is, it's pro-American. So, and it's, it gives a semblance of democracy. You're able to sell this idea. But as we talked about before, DM is widely unpopular for a number of reasons. Corruption is one, religion is two. Now, the American people agree. They are happy with this idea that America is going to spread the idea of democracy. Remember that they were successful in doing this in World War II. They were fairly successful in the Korean War, and the casualties in the Korean War were they were large, but they weren't so large that would turn people off the idea of a containment war. And they also agree with this idea of domino theory. They've been sold this idea that if they don't stop it here, it will go into Laos and Cambodia and Thailand and spread across Asia. So people have been frightened into doing this and frightened into supporting the Tonkin Resolution if you're a congressman, and you're frightened into supporting Johnson in the election in '64 if you're talking about a regular ordinary person. But the people in Vietnam, they are in favor of the Viet Cong. These are the communists in South Vietnam. If they were given a chance to elect these people, then they would. And you'll see here, the Americans would not allow elections as part of the division of Vietnam after the French left Vietnam. As part of that deal, the deal was that there were going to be free and fair elections in the South. But the Americans can't rely on a democratic victory. They are fairly sure that the results would lead to communists claiming power. And then you could say, very simply, that the communists have a mandate in the South, so why are Americans getting in the way of the people? It's easier to say without an election that, we can't have an election because Vietnam isn't secure yet, or there will be intimidation by Viet Cong, or there could be attacks. You can make a lot of excuses, but once you have that election, you have lost the mandate, and that's the thing. The mandate is the will of the people. And this is even after Diem is murdered in '63. Diem is murdered pretty soon after Johnson comes to power. And this goes to show how badly this democratic government, or seemingly democratic government, is seen in Vietnam. So what happens next? The American people are being told that the war is supported by the Vietnamese. Now, the war is being supported by some, and quite a few, Vietnamese, especially in the far south of Vietnam, like Saigon, where the key American kind of strongholds are. But the further you go north and the more rural you go as you go north, the more the Viet Cong have a lot of kind of footholds. As the war begins to progress, you get to see much more involvement of the North Vietnamese into this. And look at the tactics as to why. The Americans use what's called search and destroy missions to weed out Viet Cong fighters. So the Americans find it really, really difficult to figure out who was a foe and who was a regular, ordinary Vietnamese person. Exceptionally difficult to do. Very few of the American soldiers speak the language. When you go into these towns, a lot of the Vietnamese are dressed the same. The Americans look at them and they can't figure out who's who. And they're going, okay, well, how do we sort out this situation? What Americans do is they go in what's called seek and destroy missions, or search and destroy missions. And the idea here is that you go to a village, you then interrogate the entire village. And what was then starting to happen is that a lot of people were being killed in these search and destroy missions. So especially the men, because the Americans just assumed if you were a man in that village, you were part of the Viet Cong. Then a lot of the men would leave the villages because of what was happening and the threat of death, and would end up joining the Viet Cong anyway. And then what would happen is the village would be destroyed, be burned. So you'll see a picture on the next page of what would happen during a search and destroy mission. You see the kind of town in the background on fire. We know this is from Vietnam simply because of the uniform. The uniform is very Vietnam-esque. And you get to see how threatening an image that would be. You have the rifle with all of the rounds ready to go in it. Imagine, 30 or 40 of those guys marching into your village, how intimidating that would be. And then setting your entire village on fire, destroying your food stores. And what the Americans would do would look for kind of trap doors and foxholes to see if there was any stores of arms, of ammunition there. And people would be tortured to try and give away information. What was then starting to happen was, during these search and destroy missions, an awful lot of American soldiers were involved in the killing of innocent civilians. This was because they saw a lot of death on their own side. American soldiers would be hit by a lot of shrapnel from bombs that would go off beside them. They would be hit by bullets. And you need to look at the weapons that they were using. The Americans were using an M16 rifle. Those are really well-made rifles. They'd shoot bullets pretty much dead straight when they worked. So a Vietnamese soldier could take maybe 2 or 3 rounds and still keep firing. But the Vietnamese were using AK-47 rifles. Those weren't as well made, but meant that the bullets traveled almost in circles, because the longer the barrel, the cleaner the barrel, the more the swerve the barrel has in the middle of it, the more tilt it has, the cleaner the bullet would fly through the air. That was the M16. The AK-47s weren't as well made. It meant that the bullet weren't very accurate in a Vietnamese gun, but if it hit you, it would cause so much more damage. So Americans getting hit, so you might see in a movie where an American might get hit once and he's down, whereas the Vietnamese get hit 3 or 4 times and still keep firing. That was, accurate to what was happening at the time. So the Americans would be suffering massive casualties, and these soldiers, these young men in their teens and early 20s, would suffer massive mental trauma, would then go and then take it out on the civilian population. If we go back up to our notes again, we'll look at this in a bit more detail. And this would lead to huge civilian casualties and mass atrocities that would occur. And these mass atrocities, a lot of them were kept under the rug, where they didn't get out. But what we're going to talk about next, and one of the subsequent lessons, is the public protest. This was the first war that was covered in a massive way by the media. And when stories started to leak out of what the American, tactics were, people started to get quite a little bit worried about the American war. The American war was called, one of the operations that they used was called Operation Rolling Thunder. In Operation Rolling Thunder, they would slam from above the Vietnamese countryside. They would use gelignite, which was like a chemical that would explode when it hits foliage. Then you also have the use of Agent Orange, which is a chemical weapon. You have the use of napalm, another type of chemical weapon. The process was called the defoliate. In other words, get rid of the trees. That's how much they wanted to destroy. But how accurate are those weapons? If you think there's a Viet Cong base somewhere in a forest, if you drop all those weapons on it, how many civilians are you killing? And the Americans don't really care, because they measure success in kill counts. How many people did you kill? If you killed 100 people, then you killed 100 Viet Cong. In reality, you could have maybe killed 4 or 5 Viet Cong and 95 civilians, but that's not, how they measured success. They measure success in that. Now, to be honest, that's a silly way to measure success when it comes to war. You measure success in terms of, did you achieve your goal? The American goal is to ensure democracy in the south of Vietnam. And this process that they're doing of going from village to village and town to town, destroying these villages in the hope that the Viet Cong don't use them, only sends more people into the arms of the Viet Cong. Their decision to destroy everything from the air, whether it's in helicopter gunships where people are just mowing people down with machine guns, like, how is that going to win the hearts and minds of the people to make sure it's a democratic country at the end? That is a difficult sell to the Vietnamese when that's what you're doing to them. And this can only turn the Vietnamese people against the US. There's no other impact that this can have. And this is what will happen. Now, we'll talk about this in a lot more detail in the next couple of lessons. We talk about how Johnson's tactics were a failure, not just in Vietnam, but at home as well, and how he started to lose support for this war in America. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.